Welcome to Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, a podcast dedicated to licensed wildlife rehabilitators and the veterinarians who support them. I'm your host, Gail Buell. Techniques we discuss here are meant for licensed wildlife professionals. If you aren't licensed and trained for wildlife rehabilitation, do not attempt to capture, hold, or rehabilitate any wild animal. If you find an injured wild animal, a wildlife professional can recommend next steps. We will tackle topics about rescue, care, management, reconditioning, and releasing wildlife found in North America. This is a deep dive into each subject. We hope to give rehabilitators information they can use because they're already going to great lengths to rescue and nurse animals back to health. There are three possible outcomes in wildlife rehabilitation: release, euthanasia, and placement. An injured or orphaned wild animal's journey to restored health and independence in their natural habitat is delicate and complex. We draw techniques and expertise from many disciplines. Many animals brought into rehabilitation cannot be saved. The last gift we can give them is humane euthanasia. We'll talk more about when this is necessary. Sometimes animals are deemed non-releasable and evaluated to be suitable for a life in captivity. When that happens, we shift to a long-term approach to managing their care, training, and housing. Some such animals serve as ambassador animals, a term for animals that rehabilitators use to educate the public. Each episode, we'll speak with experts who represent specialty topics across the profession of wildlife rehabilitation, ambassador animal care and management, showcasing best practices. Recently, I spoke with Brittany Turner, Rehabilitation Director of the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Minnesota, or WRC. In this episode, we talk about how she climbed the career ladder from intern to Rehabilitation Director of one of the busiest wildlife hospitals in the world in just under 10 years. Though she now oversees all animal husbandry at WRC, she has always had a big heart for songbirds. This is part one of two of my discussion with Brittany about rehabilitating songbirds, including some of the issues unique to working with such small, fragile animals. We'll round out part one with a brief introduction to songbird feathers. Let's dive right in. Well, hello, everyone. Hi, Brittany. Welcome to the podcast. So happy that you're here. I wonder if for our listeners, you could introduce yourself and your position at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Minnesota.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to. It's great to see you. My name is Brittany Turner. Currently, I'm the Rehabilitation Director at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Minnesota. I actually started back as an intern in 2013. This will be my 10th summer this year, if you can believe it.
Wow.
I know. I met you back in 2011, so it's been a little while.
I was just thinking that, going, oh my gosh, and of course, it always circles around to me. I'm like, I am old.
Oh,
for a long time.
No, so I know. I keep telling people, I'm like, oh gosh, it's gotten old as dirt now. And I look at my mom, I'm like, what does that make you? And then she gets mad at me. So,
yeah,
I started as a songbird nursery intern back in 2013. After that, I was able to luckily be hired on as a seasonal songbird nursery manager. And then I think it was 2018, I was hired on full-time as the avian nursery director. I know I'm very avian nurseries, and y'all hear why soon. And then I got all the way up to being rehabilitation director. So now I oversee all of the animal husbandry. I work with all of my really wonderful staff on making sure that our protocols are up to date, that we're giving the absolute best care possible for the very, very, very many species that we see at WRC.
Oh, my goodness. So before I get into that, because I do want to just touch briefly on what WRC does and capacity and all that kind of thing. But how did you first get interested in trying to be at the wildlife clinic? I mean, have you always been interested in birds? Has it been okay, I'm interested in birds, but I want to do something directly with them? Were you conservation oriented? How did that happen?
Yeah, so we go all the way back to high school. It's funny. I actually had absolutely no interest in birds. A friend of mine and I always joked about how we had opened up a zoo one day. I'd oversee mammals, he'd do reptiles, and we just wouldn't have birds because I didn't care for them. Yeah. Yep, it's true. And then when I went to the University of Minnesota, I did major in biology with the hope of going to vet school. And then I started at Raptor Center first. Happened to find Raptor Center and that you guys were hiring volunteers. So I started volunteering in the clinic at the Raptor Center, and that got me interested in the big guys. And then I actually took a field ornithology course with the University of Minnesota up in Itasca the next summer.
Oh my gosh, we have more in common than I thought we did. Holy cow. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
Right.
Phenomenal field
took
station.
That course. Oh, I absolutely loved it. I took mammalogy too, but I absolutely loved the ornithology. And then that got me really into birds. I looked up internships. I actually wanted to do the mammal internship at the Wildlife Rehab Center first, but I didn't have my rabies titer. So I went into birds. I'm like, this will be fine. And I absolutely have fallen in love with them. And now I'm at 11 birds of my own at home now.
Wow. Yeah. And I know you've gotten a lot of finches. Are they all finches? Little like,
I actually haven't done my intro on Facebook of 2 of the newest arrivals. I have, hold on. I have 8 finches, 4 different species, 3 different species, 3 different species.
Okay.
3 different species of finches. And then I have a ring-necked dove that I've had. She's turning 5. I think she just turned 5. And then I actually just rescued 2 different diamond doves that were unfortunately neglected, though the people didn't really know how to take care of birds. So they didn't realize how bad they are, but throw out some fun terminology of one has bumblefoot. One has a malocclusion of his beak, so it overgrows really bad and has to get trimmed. And they're darling little sparrow-sized doves.
Wow. I don't know if I've ever seen even a picture of them. We may have to throw a picture.
So yeah.
Even though it's not native Minnesota wildlife, we may have to just put a picture up there.
I think all of the species I have are technically Australian, except for the ring-necked dove.
Okay. Well, thank you for rescuing them. Yeah, I'm very much into birds too. And I currently just have a couple cockatiels at home, but yes, I very much love birds as well. But Itasca, the field station, biology degree, all that kind of, I was headed to vet school too. So we have a lot in common, and the Raptor Center as well. But today we wanted to talk a lot about songbirds, but I don't know if the listeners going to hear that, but that's not a songbird, but she is holding one of her kitties. Do you want to introduce your kitty?
Yep. Her name is Miko. She is perfect and so naughty. I rescued her. It's actually 2 years ago, a couple days from now. I rescued her 2 years ago. She was out in the cold, and it was one of the about to be coldest days of the winter. And she was in horrible shape. She had multiple broken teeth, infected canines. She's missing all sorts of teeth now. But no, the other one's coming. Okay,
that's okay. We can meet the other one too. We may have to have pictures of those too for the kitties.
Oh, absolutely. Come here.
On the show. Oh my goodness, this is the puppy dog. Oh, Kono.
Yep,
and you just recently adopted Kono, right?
I did. Yeah. So Kona is my first dog in 6 years. My first dog as an adult, really.
Okay.
My previous one was my childhood dog. But yeah, so I adopted him a month ago yesterday.
Wow.
I'll give a shout out to Secondhand Hounds because they're a really great rescue in the cities. But yeah, he's just perfect.
Okay. Oh, that's awesome. And they're rescues too, which is near and dear to my heart too. I think all of our animals here at home are rescues.
Right.
They make wonderful pets. Just wonderful pets. And of course they need help too. So thank you for having them on the podcast. So like I said, I may have to have pictures for the show notes so everybody can see how cute they are. So
Absolutely.
back to birds. I thought, well, let's talk maybe a little bit about the wildlife clinic first, so people have an idea that if they're not familiar with the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center of Minnesota, that they have kind of at least an overview of what type of wildlife clinic and things like that. So let's give a nice, 30-second or 30,000 feet overview of WRC.
Absolutely. So Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, we last year actually hit the official busiest wildlife hospital in the world. We saw nearly 19,000 last year, so just a handful of animals.
Wow.
We are a very, very high volume center. So we take everything pretty much that is not a raptor. I should say anything wild. We don't do domestic. Mm-hmm. But we have, I think most years it's around 200 different species come through the door.
Wow.
It's very, very busy. I don't know how we're still in our tiny little building.
That's changing though, I'm hoping. I mean, that's it's on the horizon, so that's good.
So we're a very high volume center. Obviously busiest time is the summer with our 3 nurseries. We see waterfowl, a lot of songbirds, and then our busiest nursery is our mammal nursery. But the most variety is going to be our songbird nursery. I think last year we hit 50 different species in our songbird nursery alone. Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty, Minnesota, for those of you listening from outside of Minnesota, especially northern Minnesota, but Minnesota as a general rule has a high number of species of songbirds that breed here. So they're here the spring, summer, maybe early fall. And it has everything to do with, these animals are migrating back to here to breed, mostly because of our insect population, but hopefully we fulfill a lot more habitat requirements. Of course, there's still a lot of our songbirds are having a heck of a time out there with habitat changes and climate change, reducing insects, timing of when insects are out and about, all of those kinds of things. It's getting harder and harder and harder for them. But so having the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center and other rehabilitators in Minnesota that do songbirds is very important. But the wildlife clinic does, you said 50 different species? About how many individual songbirds do you do approximately?
Well, individual songbirds. At the center, I can't remember the number. In the nursery, it's over 1,000.
In the nursery, over 1,000. Wow. Because yes, you do injured adults as well. So and all of those animals are incredibly important to their populations. All of them are.
Oh, absolutely. We have done talks at NWRA about migration, and it's been one of the things I talk about briefly is how weird things keep happening. We get more and more species that seem to be migrating a little bit later, and then there aren't as many bugs, and then we're overwintering more birds every year because they're coming in just a little bit later. So by the time they get to us, they're already at peak migration and bugs are gone. Or we had one year where we had barn swallows that just didn't move on, and it got too cold, and we were getting calls about barn swallows just being found dead because their food is gone. You mentioning climate change, there's some interesting, weird things that we are noticing.
And the thing is, and I'm just going to put a plug in here for rehabilitation and our records and data, is that we are kind of on the front lines for a lot of what is happening with wildlife and climate change. And we need to be not only helping to sound the alarm, but also making sure that the people at the state level and the federal level are really keyed in and listening to us when we are saying, look, we are seeing this, whether it's an anecdotal thing or not. But the data we gather is important. And important for conservation. So not just the individual animal that comes into care, but also for the populations too, and what's happening. And rehabilitators have been on the front lines for a long time, but I think it's more critical than ever that we kind of push that push that data forward. So back to WRC in general, like how many staff? I mean, you have a lot of veterinarians on staff. I don't know how many vet techs you have. And then how is the makeup of the staff?
Yeah, so something I realized, because I forget that people aren't all in Minnesota. In my brain, everyone's in Minnesota and knows everything.
Everyone's in
right?
Minnesota. I agree.
Yeah, right? Even though right now I'm in Illinois, but that's a different problem. So our center is exclusively a wildlife hospital. We don't actually have any captive animals on site. We don't keep education animals. And we're not actually affiliated with a university, which makes us a really rare kind of single entity of a wildlife hospital.
Right.
So our staff has grown so much over the last few years, which has been essential. When I started, we had 2 seasonal songbird nursery managers. Now last year we had 5 plus a songbird nursery exclusive director.
Wow. Wow.
So our staff is bumping up a lot. So my department, I'm in the rehabilitation department, which didn't exist a few years ago. A lot of that was done by our medical team because necessity, we had to. But now we have a rehabilitation specific team. I have a staff of 5 year-round employees, plus me. And then we're around 10 to 12 seasonal managers just for nursery season, because we just have so many animals, interns, and volunteers that need care.
Right.
And yes, volunteers and interns need care too. For our vets, I don't have it off the top of my head how many we have. I think we typically we have 4 or 5 staff veterinarians. So they are the full-time veterinarians actually on staff. We have quite a few relief vets and or part-time veterinarians that help fill in shifts, help cover in the summer because it's nuts.
Yeah, there's so many hours to cover. Holy cow.
It's ridiculous. And then veterinary technicians, right now we have 4 that have actually gone to tech school. And then we have a few supporting medical veterinary technician assistants. So they're staff who are there to help the vet techs, but aren't quite trained in tech school. And that's just animal care staff, not including all of our crazy numbers of interns and volunteers and shadows and vet students who come to visit and work with us.
Right.
Yeah, we have a lot of people around.
Right. And you have a few administrative staff, right? I mean, executive director, and then is Tammy's title like communications director? Is that correct?
Yes. So Tammy is communications director, and then we added 2 staff to our communications team last year, 2023 now.
That's right.
And then we have a volunteer department as well. So we have our volunteer programs director, as well as another volunteer department staff member to help process our volunteers, get them on orientations. We typically have up to 500 to 600 volunteers throughout the year. So just a nice little number to try and juggle.
It is an amazing number of people to care for. Of course, an amazing number of animals that come through the door that need assistance.
We are incredibly lucky to be in a state where so many people care about the wildlife, because I know that that's not true in every state. We've had people who are absolutely shocked that we have 70 interns a summer, and again, about 500 to 600 volunteers a year, and they can barely get a few to help them. So I'm really thankful to live in a state and in an area that there are so many people who care about wildlife.
Yeah, it is pretty striking. And I've certainly found that as I've traveled around as well, is that I also feel very, very fortunate to be in Minnesota and have the resources for wildlife rehabilitation. But in almost any kind of conservation thing, I volunteer for a lot of things. And there's a lot of people out there that volunteer for a lot of different, whether it's planting trees or something like an Audubon chapter, or volunteering for like a wildlife rehabilitation center. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Everybody moved to Minnesota.
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's great. I mean, it's definitely the warmest state, and there's not a ton of snow. So don't worry about that.
So don't worry about that. That's right. Yeah. Believe everything Brittany says on that.
Yeah. Just don't worry about it. As mentioned, I'm in Illinois temporarily. And we have no snow. And I was talking to other staff today from WRC, and they are shocked. I'm like, no, my dog tried to eat grass this morning. We don't have any snow. And it's going to be 50 tomorrow here. It's so nice.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, it's the 10th of January. That's the date that we are recording this. And we have a few feet of snow on the ground. It's great for snowshoeing. There you go. And not too cold attempts. Not like below zero or anything. So that's okay too. But the wintertime makes it a little slower for you at the wildlife clinic. So hence I get a chance to chat with you about birds. So
right. I will say we used to say winter was our slow season, and that is not true anymore. It used to be we would all just get like less hours, just a nice break. But man, there are so many animals.
There are so many animals.
Last I looked, I think we had 200 in care right now.
Wow.
Right.
Wow. I mean, I knew that it wasn't as slow as it used to be. So we'll just take a moment and say, why do you think that is? Do you think it's because there's more development, more people interested, or just more animals getting injured?
I think all of the above. I don't think we really know exactly why our numbers go up and down. I was talking to Dr. Renee Schott, who I know has been on the podcast before. We've talked about this a bit, and she mentioned it's not too unusual for us to have this many animals because we've had, let me start with, the COVID years really messed with our numbers. We saw huge numbers of certain things. Like we broke all of our records, but then other things were less. So we got a lot more bunnies and squirrels, right? People are home, they're stuck at home. They find all the things in their yard. Mm-hmm. But surprisingly, we had less turtles coming in. And our theory is people were not driving as much, so they weren't hitting said turtles. So we only overwintered, I think it was around 10 to 15 turtles last winter and the year before, which was very low from when I started, which was like 2 to 3 rooms of turtles.
Right.
And then this year we're back to 2 rooms of turtles. I think I don't know what number we're even at now. But yeah, it's been a crazy winter we're getting a lot of things like snakes. People find them in their house in the winter. Our higher patient load in the winter is also affected by, we can't release certain things. So the number doesn't go back down. It just keeps climbing. Mm-hmm. We get bats. Luckily, we're able to hibernate them once they're healthy, but there's still a number in care. We're still caring for them. So hard to tell, but it's definitely not been a quiet winter in a long time.
Wow. Hadn't realized how much that has changed kind of over the years, right?
Yeah.
Well, really nice overview. Thank you, Brittany. So a lot of people are a lot more familiar with the wildlife clinic and how you got to be there and things like that. So we're going to focus the rest of the time on talking about birds, and specifically we're going to talk about insectivore/omnivores. And we'll explain what that is in a second if you're not sure. And we're going to focus on young birds, but it's going to be an overview because a lot of the things that you do for one species, you're going to do very similar to another species. So we thought that this would be valuable for everybody. So as far as insectivore or omnivore, insectivore means that you are an insect eater. And if you're an omnivore, you are eating animal type proteins like insects, but you would also eat plants or parts of plants like berries or seeds or things like that. So those are the two that we're going to kind of focus on today, which encompasses quite a few species.
Yeah, it does. And fun facts to throw in, some birds will start out as insectivores as infants, and then their diet adjusts to something completely different as they get older.
And that has, when I've done a lot of reading on this, and it makes sense to me that when you're a youngster, especially birds, because they grow up so quickly, they need a lot more protein. And insects, of course, have a lot. They pack a lot of protein. So it's easy to stuff the little babies' faces with, insects. And then, as they get older, then they can change their diet to something that's a little bit different, like seeds or like berries.
That's what I've read as well. So a lot of it's protein based, but yeah, it's interesting. I can't get off on too many tangents in here.
Sure, we can. We can throw out lots of little factoids. Right? I love them. I think that they eventually just round out your knowledge of the whole. So as far as these young birds, let's start at the beginning. How do they generally come to the wildlife clinic? How does that process happen? What happens to them? What are the common things that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, we're focusing more on the songbirds because you can technically consider some of the ducks like insectivores as babies, but we're not going to talk about them today.
Yep.
So baby songbirds, when they're infants, so throw out some fun terminology for people who don't know birds because you need to know more about birds.
Yes.
It's important. So there's kind of two general groups of baby birds. You have altricial versus precocial. It's not exclusive to birds. Mammals and reptiles are altricial or precocial as well. But precocial are going to be those kind of like the ducks and chickens, right? They hatch from the egg. They have some down. They're mobile. They're able to eat on their own, though. That doesn't mean they're totally self-sufficient, though there are like super precocials, but I'm not going to talk about that. So,
right.
But they're more or less a bird, right? Their eyes are open. They can move. They can start eating. Again, you see chickens, they hatch from an egg. They're immediately eating and kind of birds. What I'm talking more about are the altricial birds, which are going to be the more traditional songbirds. So they hatch naked, might have some downy floofers, but
floofers.
They hatch naked, floofers, right? They hatch naked. They're totally dependent on their parents. They have no thermoregulation, so they're completely helpless little babies. So when they're infants, a lot of times they come into the center, either their nest is disturbed, whether on purpose or not, kind of depends on the person, unfortunately. But sometimes it's storms. Their nest is blown out of a tree. Some birds build amazing nests. If you've ever seen an oriole nest, they weave and it's really intricate and awesome. And then you look at a mourning dove nest and sometimes it's a few sticks in a tree. They're so awful, but I love them dearly.
Right.
The nests are terrible, right? So it might be a nest blown out of a tree. Could be somebody's cutting their trees down, which is why we do a lot of promotion on social media of trying to get people to cut down trees if they need to. In kind of the early fall, early spring, before all of the animals are having babies.
Right.
Sometimes they're unfortunately kidnapped. I consider it bird napped. If somebody finds a baby bird, whether it's on the ground or in a nest, and they take it home, usually kids. So those are kind of the big ones, right? The nest falls out. Right. Baby birds, luckily, because a lot of their nests are up high, they're not quite grabbed like bunnies and squirrels who are on the ground and easy to find. Right. But when they're on the ground, they're totally helpless and they can get cold really quickly. So it's really important if you do have somebody who calls and has an infant baby bird. Some individual rehabbers do a lot more with reuniting with the parents, talking with the finder of, okay, can you put it back in the nest? Is there anything wrong with it? Because we're so high volume, our default is bring it in. Our veterinarians will do a health check. If it's healthy, we'll talk to the client, potentially try and have them reunite that animal back. But it's really important that that animal isn't just left on the ground. Baby songbirds, right. They really, really need their parents. So that's typically the infants. For the juveniles, we get a lot of the fledgling calls. Right. So there are some species of songbirds. Sorry. Dog.
The dog. What is Kona doing right now? What's Kona doing? Oh, so scratching my belly. He's laying on his back going, come on, Brittany, scratch my belly.
I know. He's like pushing my computer farther over to make space for him. All right. So sorry.
It is quite all right. I love it.
Right. So yeah, we get a lot of the fledgling calls, which if you work with songbirds or if you don't, you still get calls about them. The fledglings specifically, it's usually the robins, right? So Their nest is perfect for when they're little. And then the bigger they get, they can't fully grow in their tail feathers. There's not space for them anymore. So some species will jump out of the nest before they can fly, and that's okay. That's what they're designed to do. Yes, it means that they're more susceptible to predation, but it's natural. So we try really hard to keep those healthy fledglings out of the center so that we can focus more on the birds that are injured or sick or actually need our help.
Right.
But we do get a lot of calls with people really concerned of there's a robin and there's a cat roaming my neighborhood. So can I bring it to you? And we try really hard to keep those out. Unfortunately, predation is out there.
Right.
But the birds will do a lot better with their parents. We do a great job, but nothing quite matches being raised by their parents.
But you're not a robin. As much as you want to be a robin, Brittany, you're not a robin.
No, I'm not. I try.
You're not.
Try really
you do.
hard.
Or a swallow or kingbird or any of those. I mean, you're just not. You do an amazing thing, but you're just not. So I think that's really good talking about, kind of telephone kind of things. And that totally is an animal welfare thing. If we can keep these animals out of our care, that to me is perfect, right? Because the parents can do better. They do much better out in the wild. Even though most of us do an amazing job, we're still no substitute. Any other advice you would give for either challenging situations about how you would talk somebody through it, or maybe even a crazy one, a crazy call or a crazy situation, if you can recall it, of an animal?
So I think, we do a lot of, so we call it our Reunite program. So when I say Reunite, it really is putting the baby back with the parents. Our intake volunteers and intake staff do a great job of doing that. I'm not on that side of things. We get a lot more, though, kind of baby squirrels, baby bunnies, right? Mom will come back and get the baby squirrel if you leave it at the bottom of the tree. Most of the time. Obviously, there are exceptions. But baby bunnies, put it back in the nest, leave it alone. Birds, mom's not going to fly to the bottom of the tree, pick up the baby, and bring it back to the nest. So some people think they will. They don't. So we typically, too, when it's a tiny little baby songbird, if it's been out for a long time, the people find it really, really cold. We do advise bringing it in. Some people, if you don't have a lot of resources to take in and look at every bird that somebody calls about, maybe you'll try reuniting instead. For us, we do find that some of those baby songbirds, if people find them really, really cold, right? They're severely lethargic. They're really cold, right? So squinty-eyed, they're not really moving around. I advise bringing them to rehab to at least get a look, get them warmed up. You could potentially warm them up, give them fluids. If they look great afterwards, then try a Reunite.
Sure.
But if they're really, really cold, which if we talk a little bit more husbandry in a bit, if they're really cold, they can't digest food. So if they go into the nest, mom's not immediately there, they might not beg, which means they won't get fed because mom's going to look for that hungry mouth to open. In terms of interesting things, interesting calls, one of the things I've been working on since I started is, getting more species specific. A lot of people treat all insectivores, they treat them exactly the same, which in a lot of ways you can.
It works. Yeah.
But there's a lot of things that are a little bit more, you just need different care or different considerations when they come in. So one of the things, I know it's not a songbird, so I take back my songbird exclusive argument.
Okay.
But one thing that I've started doing for our center, talking to the veterinarians to do, but when we get in baby great blue herons, great blue herons are a species, they nest in really tall trees, and they actually, they are notorious for siblicide. The bigger, stronger birds will push the younger birds out of the nest. So when we get in a baby great blue heron, we don't get many, but when we do, I've started asking our veterinarians to do x-rays on admit. And I know for rehabbers who aren't at a big center, that might be more difficult. But for us, we have been finding that they have structural issues because they fell really far. So if they're just found at the bottom of a tree, they fall hard and they're big. I've been starting to try and figure out with crows too, if they're kicked out of the nest. Sometimes crows are super, super smart. not sometimes, they're always super
They're
smart.
always
But right? Sometimes when it's the family's around, but they're not caring for one of their young for one reason or another, sometimes it is because there's something wrong. Nature knows. I don't know how they know, but they know there's something wrong with that chick, so they ignore it. And then we get it in, and maybe it has a fracture somewhere, or it's sick in some way. Right. So I feel like for trying to triage birds and what should come in, what shouldn't come in, a lot of it depends on species. Knowing the natural history of each species, which is hard if you're not me.
Right. So
specializes in this, right?
Yeah. Gimme. Yeah.
But knowing what birds fledge and what don't. Something like a woodpecker, if it's on the ground, it's not fledging. They don't fledge on the ground. So if it's a baby woodpecker, just sitting on the ground and you can catch it, it's probably something wrong with it.
Something wrong.
So knowing what species are fledging, I should say, fledge on the ground, fledge before they can fly, versus what need to leave the nest flying, like swallows.
Right.
They leave the nest flighted. So if they're on the ground struggling, there's probably something wrong with the bird.
Right. All of that, just wonderful, wonderful information. I want to go back to a couple definitions. One of them is songbird. When we talk about songbirds, because you just mentioned, hey, this is not a songbird. It is a passerine, right? Because they're perching. I mean, the herons are perching birds. So how do you define songbird?
Okay, so it's a little complicated because of how we structure our center. So when I started, we had the avian nursery and the waterfowl nursery. Avian is just a term for birds, where it's actually our songbird nursery, right? So you'd think, okay, so I'll answer your question. But you think, right, songbirds, and then we have waterfowl. You're like, okay, I know waterfowl. But then you have the weird ones who aren't quite songbirds and aren't quite waterfowl.
Right.
The way we're structured more is altricial versus precocial. So what needs that intense direct care versus what can get less hands-on, doesn't need hand-feeding care.
Okay.
So at our center, we define songbirds as three, I think it's families of birds, generally. So you have Passeriformes, which are going to be your typical songbird, your typical perching bird. So the warblers, the thrushes, the sparrows, the finches, your kind of typical little perching bird. We also include Piciformes, which are going to be your woodpeckers. We include those because they are highly altricial. They hatch naked, right? They need that parental care. So they go into our songbird nursery. And then you have Columbiforms, which are my favorite. A little biased, but those are your pigeons and doves. They're not quite that typical songbird. They do hatch with quite a lot of down. But again, they're that altricial species, again, completely reliant on parents or us for care. So when I say songbird, that's kind of the groups that we put in our songbird nursery, and then I'm kind of focusing on. That being said, our herons go into our songbird nursery because they can't feed themselves. Right. And they do hatch. They hatch with their eyes open. They're a semi-altricial. I can't remember which ones are which off the top of my head.
I think there's semi-altricial for herons.
Yeah. So the herons will put in there the baby rails. So things like soras, Virginia rails, we put in our songbird nursery because if you just put them in an enclosure with food, they don't figure it out when they're really little. They need that. Their parents are not hand feeding them, beak feeding them. I struggle to say that. I'm like, their parents hand feed them. I'm like, well, no.
Wait.
Right. They're directly fed by their parents. Right. So when I say songbird, it's that kind of like that typical perching little songbird. But corvids, so things like crows and ravens are in that passerines or Passeriformes group. Technically, they're songbirds. Right. But woodpeckers are not.
Right.
Well, they're not in the same family.
Right. Same family. So that was excellent, actually. I mean, it's not that little extra detail. It's not that complicated, but I think it helps kind of define what we're talking about.
And please interrupt me for definitions constantly because I go for it.
Good. So one of the things I would like to do here for definitions, we'll get them out of the way. And then we're going to talk about, after a bird comes in, kind of what the process is to get into the nursery, and then about food and caging and all that kind of stuff. But if you were to classify a young bird coming in by age, like what would you define? There's hatchling, there's nestling, there's brancher, there's fledglings, so there's all of those different kind of categories depending on the life stage. So how do you guys define them, or how do you define it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something that we've been discussing a lot when we're trying to figure out how often to feed our birds in the nursery, because I think there should be more classifications, but that's just for my food sheet purposes, for how often to feed them. So the hatchling, I think it's up to about 3 days old. It really is the birds right after they're hatching. So they're really tiny, really difficult. If you're just starting out with birds, the hatchlings are usually the hardest to work with, because they're really, really fragile when they're tiny. The nestlings, those are going to be at the age that they are physically in the nest. They're starting to grow feathers. They're starting to thermoregulate a little bit once they start getting those feathers. But that early nestling stage, they're still pretty naked. But then they start growing pin feathers, which for definitions, that's when feathers start growing, kind of looks like porcupine quills. It's called a blood feather. So when the feathers are growing, there's a blood supply. Very painful if they get broken or pulled. But as that feather is growing in, looks like a porcupine quill, and then the feather sheath starts unfurling, and then the beautiful feather comes out. So nestlings, they're starting to grow those feathers.
Right.
Some birds, the next step would be fledglings. At least for us, people use brancher interchangeably as well, and I think more raptors use brancher.
Yeah, raptors often has that where they're on the branch. They're not flying yet. They haven't flown yet, but they're not in the nest technically either. Yeah.
Yeah. So we still group that with fledglings for songbirds. At least we do. So the fledglings are going to pretty much, the definition is when they leave the nest. So fledging is leaving the nest. That being said, again, some birds, like mentioned before, they fledge before they can fly, which makes things extra super complicated. So some will fledge, they leave the nest because the nest just isn't big enough. They need to grow up outside of it. Whereas quite a few songbirds, when they leave that nest, they're flying. Flying well, not necessarily.
Right.
But they are flighted. So their primaries and secondary feathers, so all of their flight feathers, are mostly grown in. They might still be a little bit patchy on their belly feathers, their abdomen feathers, depending on the species. But they should have their flight feathers grown in. That's how they can fly. But again, things like robins, I use them because they're the notorious fledgling that's on the ground in a yard, right? Their primaries and secondaries are still growing in. So their flight feathers are still in blood. And then they're not quite strong enough to fly yet. Okay. And pin feathers. And then after that, it's like subadult, juvenile. It gets all sorts of complicated. Some people use juvenile versus immature interchangeably. Whereas bird banders and biologists are absolutely, this is the category. And then I mix them up. Right. And the more that we can be precise in how we're categorizing them, whether it's following bird banders or whatever, actually our data is better than on the other end of that, right? It's also really important for feeding times to know kind of what general age your bird is. Maybe we'll talk about that too. Maybe there's some tips and tricks for people who don't normally do the volume that you do, that you just, I know exactly, what age you are and what you are and all that kind of stuff, but we'll get into that in a moment. I did want to mention for people who haven't seen pin feathers before, not only do they look like porcupine quills, most often they look blue. And that's because of the blood supply that is in that shaft that is feeding that feather as it grows. And the reason that, it hurts if it gets broken or anything, it also has a nerve supply until that feather is fully grown. And once it's fully grown and that protective sheath has flaked off, which actually helps condition the feathers, by the way.
when that happens, then the feather is quote unquote dead. It's kind of like if I got my hair cut, I'm not gonna, unless someone yanked on my hair, which I'm gonna feel at my scalp, somebody can cut my hair and it doesn't hurt. And it's the same thing with bird feathers. Once they are fully grown in, you don't want to yank on them because that hurts and it's not good. But you could, if you cut them, it's not going to hurt them at that point. So just wanted to put that in there because feathers, oh my gosh, feathers are, you and I are going to do a podcast just on feathers.
I almost brought it up for this one and I'm like, ooh, I should, but no, I'm talking briefly at NWRA about it. But I actually did a talk for our volunteers about feathers and oh my gosh, I love them. Do you want another quick fun fact?
I want another quick fun fact.
Awesome. So, and I haven't found this as like data, but anecdotal from rehab. So some bird species, the parents will help preen the sheaths, the feather sheaths on the infants, infants, I should say this kind of is pre-fledge kind of is what we do at our center. So if I say infant, usually it's pre-fledge. Okay. But I should say, so the nestling stage, the parents, some species, the parents will help the babies preen. So preening is when they are, how would you describe this? I always have a hard time describing.
It's a grooming,
like a video.
Yeah, it's grooming, and they're running their beak through their feathers. Usually they can use their feet too, but it's mostly their beak. And then they can straighten out the feather. But as far as that sheath is concerned, it kind of helps take that off if they're working it. But it's mostly beak work. And they will go individual feather by individual feather. So did that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So sometimes the adults will help preen the nestlings. So when we get in baby birds that maybe haven't been around mom or dad for a day or two, we have some species that are notorious for coming in with that feather sheath not having been preened. So their feather condition can be affected by this. So if you get in a bird, right, where the blood supply is, it's blue. You don't want to get too close to there. But sometimes it'll be gray and there'll be feather sheaths still coating a lot of the feather because the parents aren't preening. And some species I have no issues. Northern cardinals and common grackles, for some reason,
isn't that interesting?
Not always, a lot of the time when they come in at kind of like that, not quite fledged, but older nestling, they're just not preening. And then if you're working with these birds, be extra super careful. I don't let volunteers or interns do this ever because you can hurt the bird. Yeah, but we'll gently sometimes try and kind of gently rub that feather sheath that's extra. You can see it's like a long gray. I can possibly send you a picture of this to put with this talk if that would help.
Oh, that would be great. That would be very helpful to kind of talk about exactly what that kind of looks like.
And I will say it's incredibly satisfying from a personal standpoint to help preen birds.
I've done this. Oh my gosh, I love it too. And the other thing is that if you're doing a larger bird, a lot of times, sometimes with the raptors, they're larger, so it's a little bit easier. When you get a lot of that sheath material in your fingers and you rub it between your fingers, it's like lotion. And it's so soft. It's so soft. It is. Yeah. Okay. All right. I better move on. Yes, we're going to do one on feathers, just on feathers, because oh my gosh, what an amazing mechanism that this massive, over 10,000 species in the world are birds, and feathers.
I've done a whole bunch of fun research into how they get their color, and I've been, right. A plug for a future one. I love holding up blue feathers. Did you know bluebirds are blue?
Yes. It's so I totally, that's my only magic trick. And it's not magic, but it's my only magic trick.
Every time I get a new blue feather, I'm like, maybe this one will be blue. And I'm like, no, still not blue.
Still not blue. We're going to let the everyone who's listening kind of like, what do you mean it's not blue? We're going to let them sit with that. So that way, when we have the podcast on feathers, then they'll want to listen in because it'll be really fun. That was part one of my in-depth discussion with WRC Rehabilitation Director Brittany Turner on caring for songbirds. By the way, if you're attending the 2023 NWRA Symposium this spring, be sure to check out our session on feathers. In part 2, we'll discuss the general songbird rehabilitation process from admission and initial exam through release. So stay tuned. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release, Season 2. Wildlife Rehabilitation from Rescue to Release is a production of Partners for Wildlife, working hand in hand with wildlife rehabilitators and veterinarians to improve the welfare of orphaned, ill, and injured wildlife. Our executive producer is me, Gail Buell. I'm the Partnership Coordinator for Partners for Wildlife at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine's Raptor Center. To learn more about the Raptor Center and Partners for Wildlife, please visit us at raptor.umn.edu. Our producer is Kirk Clockey. Special thanks to our guest Brittany Turner, WRC, Partners for Wildlife, and the Raptor Center at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. And that's our show. Hope you'll join us again next time.